So good morning or good evening or hello. Céad míle fáilte, bienvenue à tous. We're just waiting now for more people to join and then we'll begin with introductions. You can see a holding slide, so those who are online now can see the holding slide. It means you're in the right place. So we'll just give maybe another few seconds. We can see more people joining. So since we're now at the time that we said we'd start, although I can still see more people joining, I'll just start introducing. So Céad míle fáilte, bienvenue à tous, tēnā koutou katoa. All welcome to the first webinar by the group Drs-say-no International. We're very honoured to have Dr. Ramona Coelho as our guest speaker this morning. Dr. Coelho will present for about 25 minutes, and that leaves us with approximately 25 minutes for questions. Now, your questions will go under the Q&A, and Dr. John Kleinsman, a co-panelist here, will attend to those questions. So just to encourage you, any questions you have, feel free to put them as you think of them during the presentation, and then we'll attend to them all. There's plenty of time following Dr. Coelho's presentation. And we'll just see now how many are online. So there's 26 people internationally online. Just to say also, we've Dr. Catherine Ferrier and Dr. Leonie Herx will join us in responding to the questions at the end of Dr. Coelho's presentation. So sticking with the correct time, Dr. Coelho, do you wish to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Dr. Ramona Coelho. I'm a family practitioner in London, Ontario, in Canada. And my practice is of a diverse group of patients, many of them who are in a lower socioeconomic bracket, and many who face financial and other obstacles to care. I take care of many patients with disabilities and many patients who have more severe mental illness. This presentation I'm giving today is to try to highlight the risks, particularly to vulnerable and marginalized persons in the legalization of assisted dying. Just before we start, I'll just say that I'm going to use the word MAID all the time. And because in Canada, the legal definition of MAID is euthanasia and assisted suicide, which is a euphemism. But for ease, and given the fact that I'm speaking about our Canadian jurisdiction, I will be using the term MAID. Although 99+% of the cases in Canada are actually euthanasia cases. I'm gonna try to, there we go. Okay, so if you would like to have a written backgrounder, there are 2 articles in the World Medical Journal in November and December that I've co-authored with some confreres. We do have a new piece that's been accepted by Cambridge Press and hopefully will be out shortly as well for a more comprehensive read on this issue. My presentation is mostly highlighting cases to highlight this kind of policy gaps, but just to quickly bring people up to speed who might not be aware, in Canada, there was a court case, the Carter court case, in which the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that an absolute prohibition on assisted suicide and euthanasia was unconstitutional. The government then in 2016 created its first legislation to allow MAID, euthanasia and assisted suicide, for people who met a certain set of criteria. So it must be under our health insurance, our general Canadian health insurance, must have death as reasonably foreseeable, must have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, be over 18 capable, the request must be voluntary, providing informed consent by teaching patients about other options. And there was a bunch of other safeguards that went with that. And our government promised to do a safety review, a parliamentary review of this legislation and how it went about in Canada and our medical system, but they did not. And instead, in 2021, they created a new legislation, an expansion legislation. And the original legislation, which had death being reasonably foreseeable as a necessary criteria, became track 1. And track 1, many of the safeguards were dismantled to the point in Canada, if you meet the kind of open diagnosis, so reasonably be foreseeable is not interpreted as terminal illness with a strict prognostication kind of measure. In fact, in certain court cases, it's been decided that a 77-year-old woman with osteoarthritis would be qualifying based on the fact that her death was reasonably foreseeable based on her age. But if you qualify for track 1, you can now receive death in principle the same day as you request it if 2 MAID assessors deem that you meet that criteria. And a new track was created in 2021, track 2, where for people with basically de facto disabilities who are not dying. So this track 2 eligibility, you must have a serious and incurable illness. You must be in a state of irreversible decline. You must be suffering. Death can be administered in a minimum of 90 days after your first assessment. So it's very quick. Patients need to be informed and offered other treatment options, but patients can get MAID if they refuse standard care or can't access standard care. So being informed and offered doesn't mean that it's actually been accessed or tried. And the last very important point about our Canadian legislation is that suffering is purely subjective. There's no further clinical validation required when a patient says that they are intolerably suffering. And we'll get to why that is so dangerous when we talk about our examples shortly. 4 United Nations representatives, the Human Rights Commission of Canada, over 100 Canadian disability and social justice organizations, Indigenous advocacy groups, elders, leaders, hundreds of medical and legal experts have expressed their concern about our legislation and the risks to vulnerable peoples. So I'm going to start with some cases and go through what went wrong and how I feel these are kind of premature wrongful deaths. Okay, so Donna Duncan, she had a concussion, a vibrant lady. I've met her daughters. It took her over a year to receive specialized care, during which time she began to deteriorate emotionally. She received euthanasia within 4 days of request. Her daughter said she had no terminal illness. So this would be even against our legislative safeguards, the way that they're written, even though they're so open. She still should not have died within 4 days. But the girls were unable to get any recourse. So they launched a police investigation. The police tried to investigate. The hospital said that the daughters were not acting in the best interest. They refused to turn over the files, and the case was closed. So it's been over a year that Donna has died. Her daughters are terribly grieving. They don't want her memory to be forgotten. They have a page like in memory of Donna, and they have no recourse. They don't know what happened. Similarly, Alan Nichols, he had recurrent episodes of depression. He lived independently with some mild disabilities. The police pick him up for a wellness check and they admit him involuntarily to the hospital. And then he has a prolonged hospitalization, and to the utter dismay of the family, who find out days before Alan is euthanized. This was under the first regime where you had to have a reasonably foreseeable death. And again, Alan, to his family's knowledge, had no reasonably foreseeable death. The family contacts the police send them to the college sends them back to the police. So it's been years now. They've written to over 40 letters. They're a very smart family that know how to advocate for themselves. They've tried to contact multiple politicians for help, nothing. They have no answer as to why Alan was allowed to be euthanized when he didn't meet the criteria, and the application that they were shown that his reason for going through with this was hearing loss. So, despite Health Canada having set up no proper data collection, which is what I was alluding to with Donna and Alan, and that these cases that were not actually picked up by Health Canada as problematic, other oversight bodies in Canada have detected problems. Our chief coroner of Ontario, the other province of Quebec has picked up problems. The correctional officer has picked up problems in prisons of MAID going forward. There are problems in its enactment of even following the legislation, but there seems to be no accountability. Health Canada, which is our kind of government body that should oversee this process, only receives information that is self-reported by MAID providers after the death. So it's very unlikely that they're going to uncover issues that way. And then we have many families now that are suffering. There have been several articles in our papers about families who are grieving without answers in Canada. This patient in the region where I work was a man who had a stroke. It was a very small stroke. The stroke neurologist felt that he would be able to regain most of his balance, that he would be able to walk again. But when he was acutely admitted after his stroke, he was isolated because COVID, so he couldn't see his family. He requested euthanasia. He had actually been diagnosed with an adjustment disorder by the psychiatry team. And the MAID providers, the euthanasia assessors who came to see him, had no understanding of stroke recovery, like it was not their expertise at all. And in this acute phase, so he's struggling with his mood, he's isolated, he has no therapy to gauge his final level of function, he receives euthanasia. He also did not have a terminal diagnosis, but they said that because he was adapting to a thickened diet, he did not aspirate. He was tolerating exactly what nutrition was sending him, but because he was only eating 1,300 calories a day, they said, no, that's track one, he's malnourished, and he died within a week of his second assessment with no reflection period. So what are the problems with this case? They're twofold. One is challenging presumptions of the quality of life and the value of people with disabilities. So ableism is the kind of belief that people with disabilities have less value, or that really they must be very unhappy and would prefer to be dead. And physicians are not spared from these biases. If you look at the first study that's up in the top right-hand side, physicians consistently rate the quality of life of people with disabilities as quite poor. And if you look at the bottom, all those studies, these are people with severe disabilities. They rate their quality of life as quite high, actually the same as age-matched healthy individuals most of the time. And that bias can work against us in the healthcare field when we presume that someone would rather be dead. Further, we have lots of scientific literature that shows that, after a big illness or injury, there is a time for adjustment and recovery, but adjustment and recovery is overwhelmingly possible and the norm. So suicide rates or suicidality is very high after new injury or illness, which is understandable, but by 2 years has returned to the normal rate as the regular population. So ending this gentleman's life while he was acutely ill with good prognosis could be a reflection of ableism. They couldn't see how his life was valuable anymore, or it could be a lack of understanding about recovery and adjustment and what he actually needed. Second case, also in the region where I live, is a 71-year-old widower who was admitted to the hospital for falls. During his admission, he contracts C. difficile. He tells his daughter that he hears people making fun of him, the smell of his room. He feels utterly humiliated. He develops new shortness of breath, and a hospital team member suggests, has he thought about medical assistance in dying? He gladly agrees that this is a great option for him. And the MAID procedure is booked, the euthanasia procedure is booked before he even has his second assessment. And within 48 hours of his first assessment, he is dead. The family feels that MAID could have been raised to him because his stay was longer than was planned. And they also feel that he might have chosen MAID because the team made him feel terrible. As opposed to other legislation in other jurisdictions, there's no legal prohibition in Canada on raising MAID, suggesting it to a patient. In fact, the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, so this is the kind of advocacy group for MAID of doctors that the government has allowed to really guide legislation and practice delivery in Canada. In fact, they're funding them $3.3 million to kind of create a scientific curriculum around MAID. They have a document called the Bringing Up MAID, where they suggest that everyone who qualifies should know that this is an option for them if they are meeting these criteria. But offering MAID to a patient who has not raised it can effectively encourage suicide. Patients may interpret an offering of MAID as a sign that their suffering is going to be pretty bad, and that maybe they should take that way out. And further, again, in this kind of suggestion, a healthcare worker's unconscious or conscious biases can play a role. Like, who do you see as benefiting from death could partly play into who do you see as valuable or not, such as an ableism, but also in terms of other things. In Canada, we have a big problem with Indigenous specific racism in healthcare. We had a story that was in Times Magazine of Joyce Etchiquan. She was a mother of 7 on a First Nations reserve in Quebec, who died while streaming onto Facebook Live her healthcare workers racially abusing her. And it's understood, and there's different reports. There's a BC report in plain sight of patients, Indigenous patients, being negatively impacted by the healthcare system with negative outcomes and delaying access to care because of the way that they're treated. The disability community also suffers from ableism in the hospital of a treatment like they need to take an advocate, they need to make sure that they explain that their lives are valuable to themselves, are also very worried about this kind of offer of MAID. And the Disability Filibuster, which is a group in Canada, wrote this quote. I'll just read part of it. People spoke of being afraid to seek medical help because they are worried about their physician raising the possibility of MAID to them. They even went so far as to say that they will be avoiding medical care. And again, another one of my patients, but after a national documentary showed a gentleman's euthanasia provision on screen, and it was set up as a very kind of wonderful way to amazing experience, a patient of mine watched that documentary and told me that this is very appealing to her, that this would be a good way for her to go. My patient just turned 50. She's in her early midlife. She has a very mild spinal cord injury, so she can walk and do many other things, but she has some symptoms that she's not comfortable with. And in our system, she qualifies now for MAID within 90 days. But just to give you a timeline, I first told this story, I think, over a year ago, but it's been 2 years and she still has not had access to all the specialized care resources, peer support, admission for her symptoms to control them. It hasn't happened yet because on the list of priorities, she's considered to be quite well compared to other patients with more severe spinal cord injuries. And yet she's constantly thinking of MAID. This case, besides showing that the 90-day timeline is ridiculous that we have in Canada, which has no start time, like it's not like after certain years of disability or adjustment, etc., nothing. It also shows that like 90 days is not enough for us to actually access specialized care in Canada, or probably lots of places. It also doesn't, the case kind of demonstrates how suicide contagion has not been considered in the legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia in Canada. So when Robin Williams committed suicide in the States, suicide rates went up. When we have Indigenous youth suicides in our reserves, often it sets off a clustering of suicides that follow. And why is that? It's because suicide messaging versus messages of hope impact our choices. And the other thing that's very important that we know from the suicide prevention literature is that access to lethal means increase the risk of suicide and homicide for vulnerable people who are at risk. So, pesticides or guns, etc. So when you message people that there is an end, that they can choose death for their life suffering, when you make it available and easily accessible through a procedure like this, what will this do to people? And interestingly, MAID expansionists, not all, but some MAID expansionists in Canada have argued that this will, including our justice minister, this is a humane option to end people's lives as opposed to like gun violence or bridge jumping. This is a more humane way with closure for the family, and that this will reduce people's needs to feel that they need to die that way. And yet our European research shows that this is most likely a myth. At very least, suicides do not go down in jurisdictions with legalized euthanasia and assisted suicide. And this doesn't even account for people who might have been ambivalent who will now take advantage of our MAID system to die. This story, very tragic. All Is Beauty was a short film that was put out by our upscale department store, Simons in Canada. And it had a bunch of advertising trailers attached to it. And it was a woman in her last days before she received euthanasia, Jennifer Hatch. She was 37 years old. And they have her in the forest on a beach with her friends. And she says in the movie or the video, even as I seek to end my life, there's still so much beauty. But after she died, another news agency reporter revealed that she had spoken up months before under a pseudonym about wanting to live, but her struggles to get treatment and care for her rare disease. And she was accessing medical assistance in dying in the hope that she would get better care. But instead what happened is that she was approved very quickly and she died within months at the age of 37 in October of 2022. So you have the social media kind of glorifying the way her choice, but we actually know that her choice was fueled by psychosocial, like the negative determinants, social negative determinants of health. And I think that this is the thing that people are going to, like a lot of people in Canada are not understanding, is that, there are very high rates of comorbidity for disability, mental illness, and like structural inequalities. And so people might be affected and choosing death, and they might qualify because they have a disability, but that choice might still be driven by psychosocial distress, by things that could be remediated, things that are remediable, like poverty or better care, etc. In Canada, we had an outcry over certain patients being offered MAID, even though it's allowed for other patients. So there was a very sad story of this veteran. She was a Paralympian, but she's been waiting for 5 years to get a ramp installed outside her house so she can get in and outside her house. In fact, there was a video on it. It was very sad to see like how she's not able to get down the stairs. And Veterans Affairs, her caseworker, instead offered her medical assistance in dying. And several other veterans who had called Veterans Affairs to get resources were offered medical assistance in dying. Big uproar that shouldn't happen. They should be getting resources. And I think we all agree. But Dr. John Mayer wrote, "Why are some politicians so upset over the offers of death to veterans and not to other groups of citizens? Whether my mental or physical disability has resulted from noble service to my country or from a car accident or from a brain disease, the bottom line is that each and every person deserves care and support." Raymond Bourque-Monet, he's a case of a gentleman who chose MAID on the basis of his disability, but at the end of his life, he pointed out, and the story was run about how his long-term care room reached 30 degrees Celsius. He had to keep his door open to have air conditioning access, and then people would wander in and possibly touch him or take him stuff, and he always had anxiety about this. And so you could say that he chose MAID on the basis of his disability, but what did his living conditions, how could that have influenced his choice is an important consideration. There was a Canadian study, the government commissioned a study by the University of Guelph, who partnered with Dawn Canada in 2021. And it was the disability inclusion study about the government's response to the COVID pandemic. And in that study, the authors noted that people with disabilities were encouraged to explore the option of MAID for a lack of resources to live when they had not been contemplating this option. The authors noted that Bill C-7 allows a person with disability to choose death for intolerable suffering. However, the authors note that a lack of social, economic, and health supports increases the perception of intolerable suffering from the disability. Satya Kovac, 44, chose MAID, and she said, I didn't choose this because of my disease. I'm choosing MAID because of the system. She was not able to access the home care she needed to live in kind of a life that was acceptable to her, and she chose medical assistance in dying. Sophia, there was a CTV story on Sophia where she had chemical sensitivities, but she was on disability support, which is very low in Canada, and she couldn't find affordable housing where there wasn't certain irritants that would affect her health, and so she chose MAID. So our federal government has seemingly made a commitment to prioritize and make MAID universally available, like it's everywhere. Kathy can even talk later about the Quebec bill because she's from Quebec, but there is no positive right to timely healthcare in Canada, publicly funded healthcare in Canada. And our parliamentary budget officer estimated that euthanasia and assisted suicide would have significant cost savings, which is understandable when you end the lives of people who need a lot of care early by many years. And that itself is very worrisome, like that perverse disincentive that exists for governments and healthcare authorities when you have this kind of legislation. Our disability inclusion cabinet minister said during one of the parliamentary hearings on MAID that it is easier to access MAID than to get a wheelchair in some parts of our country. Okay, this article, I think people are interested, like, sometimes we think, okay, well, people are like, especially in Canada, if these cases are happening, they're one-offs, and people are saying it's bigger lobby groups, and the expansionists are saying they're not really happening. But this article has leaked videos, training sessions from the MAID Assessors and Providers of Canada. So CANMAP, the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, that the government is funding to guide MAID delivery in Canada. They host these webinars and they have their experts. And in some of these videos that you can see in this article, No Other Options, some of these MAID experts are condoning doctor shopping until you find a doctor that aligns with your opinion with your own, so you can get the patient MAID, or that poverty can be a defensible rationale for medical assistance in dying. And one of the experts laughs as she tells medical trainees that family anger is probably the biggest problem that they're up against. So, like I said, you have these videos that are leaked and they're public now, but still you have many of the lobby groups saying that this is like either a one-off or not happening. Dying with Dignity, which is our expansionist lobby group in Canada, has a myth and facts page that says, fact, suffering from a lack of social supports alone does not qualify a person for MAID. No one can receive MAID on the basis of inadequate housing, disability supports, or home care. Okay, so this is misleading because we have patients who are saying that they're accessing MAID for these reasons. It's true that they might be getting approved by the assessor on the basis of their disability, but they are choosing MAID for these reasons. And other quotes that kind of point to the fact that this is happening in Canada, Stephanie Green is the president of CAMAP, this group I keep alluding to. In her first quote, she's being interviewed about a patient with long COVID. So we don't even know long-term prognosis yet at this point, but this patient with long COVID who was a chef, can't go back to work, and says she's considering MAID because she won't be able to have a job and she financially can't cope. So she's saying it's MAID for financial reasons. And Stephanie Green's quote, "Our health system is woefully inadequate in serving our population with these resources, but I do not think we can hold these patients hostage." She's saying keeping them alive is holding people hostage. It's like a reverse of harm. And then a Canadian academic bioethicist speaking about MAID for psychosocial suffering or poverty, limiting MAID, so he's saying limiting MAID for these reasons would translate into removing the agency of decisionally capable patients without offering them a way out of their predicament. And Dr. Ellen Wiebe, she said at a parliamentary hearing that she'd assessed 750 people for MAID and ended the lives of 430 by May 2022. She talks about how if a patient is on a waiting list for care that would remediate their suffering, but they're suffering in the meantime, and the waiting list is long, she'll give them MAID. So these statements ignore the predicament of these people that our society has created through structural inequalities that have led to death being an attractive choice in the first place. And a very recent article, I don't know if you guys have seen Wiebe and Mullen, it was in the Journal of Medical Ethics, clearly argues that no longer denying MAID for psychosocial suffering, but actually affirming that this is like a form of harm reduction and you're giving people choice and autonomy to die. And yet it's a kind of perversion of harm reduction, which was about saving lives, right? This is about ending people's lives. Secondly, structural coercion and poverty undermine meaningful autonomy, right? Are these free decisions if they're made in the crucible of poverty? And it leads to desperate choices, I would say, not autonomous choices. So just to end this, the last slide, MAID or legalization of assisted suicide in euthanasia puts vulnerable patients at risk. A lot of it has to do with these things that I've written in the left-hand side. Will the practitioner in front of you favor suicide prevention or assisted suicide? Which will be easier to access to you? What medical options can you afford? Who's going to advocate for you? Does the doctor in front of you value your life? And you might not even know the answer to that. And so really the safest thing is to keep this whole thing from moving forward. Canada is now, we're in the very bad position of trying to like rein back and try to have safeguards while we have all these atrocious stories. And I would say that the safest regime is no regime, where you keep assisted suicide criminalized. In Canada, just to give you an update to see how far we've gone, we were supposed to have MAID for mental illness in March 2023, but there's a lot of kind of pushback in the public. And so the government just said, fine, we're going to do it in March 2024. Already a government review group, the parliamentary review has suggested that we have MAID for mature minors and advanced requests. Our government has responded and said to the review group, and we'll consider it, but not at this time. And then Bill 11 passed in the province of Quebec. Quebec is approaching a rate of 7% of all deaths being from MAID. Quebec has passed Bill 11, which is going to force all palliative care and all institutions to provide medical assistance in dying on the premises, as well as advanced requests for people with dementia. So that's even more so than what Bill C7 has. Okay, that's it. Thank you, guys.